I'm Fonzo.
And I'm Eliza.
And we're the co-host of Grown, a podcast from the Moth that shows we're never fully grown.
Growing up feels like a phase that should end at some point, but does it ever really? Whether you're 16 or 26 or 86, you're gonna have to deal with family drama, your body, and the type of person you want to be. So why not put it all out in the open and go through it together?
Join us every other week to deal with cringe, culture, and the courageous efforts of people like you to get grown.
Start listening today. Follow Grown on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening right now.
Hey, it's Anita. Somehow it is almost the end of January, and so far 2022 is shaping up to be pretty bizarre. It is for me, and I'm guessing it also is for y'all. But one of the true shining lights has been putting our Resolved series out into the world and seeing y'all listen to and engage with the anti-diet culture message, as well as seeing it picked up by so many new folks. Today, we are bringing you part 3 in the series, which is a conversation about body neutrality. It is one that some of you may have heard before when it first aired last year, but it is a really good time to revisit it because you've just refreshed your knowledge about the history of diet culture, you've added intuitive eating as a tool to your anti-diet culture toolbox, and I want to invite you to make this year the one in which you spend more time living in your body and less time looking at it in the mirror. And today's show will help you get there. It's an absurd memory, but I can recall it like it was yesterday. I was 11 or 12 and accompanied my older sister and mom to a tailor where she was getting some clothes fitted. I was wandering around the store amusing myself and ended up at the counter just in time to hear the tailor remark to my mom, "You won't have to worry about her," pointing to my sister. "This one," she said, pointing at me, "she should only eat fish and lean food. She's likely to gain fat." It is such a weird story and wholly inappropriate for so many reasons. But more than 2 decades later, it still occupies brain space because it marked something. It was the first time I registered the idea that my body size was something to worry about. Genetics gave me a petite frame and small body, thin privilege. And still, it's been a long and ongoing road to shift my attention away from how my body looks. The multi-billion-dollar diet culture industry thrives on people believing that making their bodies smaller will lead to more happiness. But I know that all of us, especially those in more marginalized bodies, deserve better. This is Embodied, our show about sex, relationships, and your health. I'm Anita Rao. Shifting from critiquing every belly roll to loving yourself no matter your size may seem like an unrealistic leap. That's where body neutrality enters the conversation. The philosophy asks you to consider whether you could move to a mindset of neutrality. Your body is neither good nor bad, ugly nor beautiful. It just is. And beyond that, you are not your body.
When I think about body neutrality and what it means to being in this body, I think about things that my body can do for me, like my heart is beating and it's keeping me alive, or my lungs can breathe in oxygen, and that way I can do cool stuff because I have oxygen that goes to my brain. I think it helps think about these things in terms of neutrality because there's no external judgment factors that go into that. It's based in more fact versus myths that we tell ourselves, and it helps reframe and keeps us in line with gratitude for our bodies.
For a long time, body positivity has been pushed as the only way to get out of the body negative state a lot of people are in, but neutrality might be a better option for most people or even a stepping stone to get to positivity. For me, it's like maybe we kind of need a mix of both. I want to be able to go through my day without having to think about my body and just be neutral. But when it comes time to put on a cute outfit and go out with friends, I do want to be able to look in the mirror and really love how I look.
You just heard from two of our listeners, mental health and intuitive eating counselor Kate Sutton and Chloe Conrad from the blog Fashionable Enough. Body neutrality is one part of a larger movement pushing for fat acceptance and body-based justice liberation. One of the folks in that movement who I've long admired is Virgie Tovar. She's a fat activist, host of the podcast Rebel Eaters Club, and the author of You Have the Right to Remain Fat and The Self-Love Revolution.
Honestly, I see body neutrality as a bit of a critique to body positivity, and I'm really into it.
Virgie spends more time in the realm of body love than body neutrality, and that has to do with her own personal journey and political context as a woman and a person of color.
As someone who is a fat person and someone who is, is still recovering from years of disordered eating and exposure to diet culture, I think for me, my body has become the center point of a lot of my development as a human being.
Virgie grew up in a fat body in a fat family. And in her early years, long before she came to this work, she had what she describes as a really beautiful relationship with her body. Then, when school started, the bullying began.
It was very painful, going from having this great relationship to my body to internalizing this sense something was wrong with me and that I should be ashamed of myself. And I did what a lot of people in that situation do. And I went on to have disordered eating and obsessive exercise, was part of my life for 20 years. And the collective results of what it was like being treated so poorly and told that I was unlovable and ugly and a monster. I'm still working through the long-term effects of that.
So then how did you move from those years of being in that mindset that your body was a problem to realizing that actually society was the problem? What was that turning point for you?
Yeah, there were a few turning points. I certainly, the first time that I went on a date and someone said I was attractive, that was a huge moment. It's on the one hand, not really a super radical thing. And on the other hand, completely blew my mind because I had been told that I was never going to, be attractive to anyone, until I became a thin person, which of course, as a naturally fat person, I was never going to become a thin person. And then I happened to date someone who was fat positive, and that was really incredible and really didn't have that language. But now in retrospect, I'm like, oh, that was a fat positive relationship. And he really helped me recuperate my relationship to food as well. And there were these beautiful moments where we'd be cooking together and he would just, walk me through becoming less terrified of cheese, right? Which when you're somebody who's terrified of their body, cheese is this enormous, monumentally terrifying thing. And so, that, and then certainly the biggest turning point for me was being introduced to fat liberation ideology and fat activism. And it really blew my mind. I had been a feminist. I had been anti-racist. I'd been an activist since I was 18 years old. And yet, at no point anybody told me it's okay to be fat.
It's so interesting what you say that, for so long, no matter what you were doing or what your relationship with food was, there was kind of this internalized belief that your body could be another way. And I think for me, learning that body diversity is real and there is real science behind the fact that we are, even if we all eat the same and move the same, our bodies would not look the same. So talk to me about what body diversity is and what coming to that kind of meant for your own realizations.
Yeah, I think that we have this really reductive and actually anti-scientific attitude about bodies and food, right? There's still the prevailing idea that food is fuel exclusively and that bodies are machines, right? So I think that once I got into the literature and really reading the research, it just became so clear. And there's this amazing little tutorial called the Trouble with Poodle Science, where this just amazing.
I've seen this. This is amazing.
Yeah, it's the Trouble.
Yes.
It's this amazing video on YouTube. And it talks about how we've been told that every single human being is one kind of dog, and that that a German Shepherd is simply a weird looking poodle, or a Chihuahua is just a tiny poodle. And in actuality, right, we're like Chihuahuas and Mastiffs, and there's real beauty beauty in that when you kind of can embrace like, oh, right. And I think that the punchline for that video is like, in the same way that we understand that the dog breeds have these different strengths and these different risk factors, if we began to open up our scope of what the diversity, the real diversity that exists of humankind, we'd be able to see like, oh, this person's body is really, really well equipped for like this thing. They're very talented at this. And I remember that one of the first stories I heard when I was becoming a fat activist that blew my mind was a new friend told me that she had been in a car accident that would have killed her, but because she had a belly, she survived. And the doctor literally said, if you hadn't had a belly, your internal organs would have just been destroyed. And so it was, like that kind of story just doesn't exist in the social imaginary, and beginning to accumulate those things, you begin to see like, oh, right. Like there's a spectrum of body size. There's a spectrum of what those body attributes, et cetera, like do for a person, and how there's like strengths and weaknesses in every kind of body size.
If you haven't seen the poodle science video, trust me that it is worth a watch. Finding gems like that reminds me how beautiful and healing the internet can sometimes be. The digital world, and especially places like Tumblr, Instagram, and now TikTok, have become hubs for body image conversations. And that, of course, has its pros and cons. Earlier this year, Lizzo called attention to a trend that other folks in the body liberation space have also been noticing. Thin, white influencers have started to shift the focus of the body positivity movement. Fat people are still getting the short end of this movement, Lizzo said. We're still getting talked about, memed, shamed, and no one cares anymore. So how far has the body positivity movement strayed from its roots? And how did it start in the first place?
Well, when folks talk about the roots of body positivity, often what they're talking about is the social media body positivity movement that kind of exploded on Tumblr and Instagram in the 2000s. But the grand elder of that movement is the fat acceptance movement.
Tigress Osborne is the chair of National Association to Advance Fat Acceptance, or NAFA. It's an organization that was founded in 1969 and part of the beginning of the documented, organized fat acceptance movement.
I always like to point out that we're talking about the documented, organized movement because there have always been sort of badass, fat-ass people living their lives. And, we also know that there's been a tremendous amount of fat leadership in other kinds of social justice and civil rights movements, especially the Black American civil rights movement. But NAFA was started by Bill Fabry, who at the time was a young engineer who was, a skinny guy, a cisgender, straight, white guy. And he really loved his fat wife and was really angry about the discrimination that he saw her facing in the workplace, in social settings, in trying to find clothing, all of the things. And so he sort of teamed up with an author named Lou Lauterbach, who wrote one of the first fat acceptance books and who was writing in the Saturday Evening Post about American attitudes about fat. And so let's start this national organization to support fat people. And it was really revolutionary in that they were labeling fat people as fat in a non-pejorative way. But for some people who were involved in the early movement, NAFA wasn't quite revolutionary enough. And so the other sort of pillar of the early organized movement is the Fat Underground, which was a group of radical fat feminists who started in the Los Angeles area and who wrote this fat manifesto that just declared, opposition to the diet industry, called out the medical industry for the ways that they had, pathologized fat and mislabeled fat people's health, took the media to task for the way they were showing fat people, and, connected it to gender issues and feminism, but also really connected this movement to solidarity with other anti-oppression causes.
And one of the things about that foundation is it really acknowledges intersectionality at its core. And I feel like folks at the Fat Studies movement have been really trying to track the racial origins of fat phobia and make that connection more prominent in the conversation today. Can you tell me a bit about that connection?
Yeah, I think historically in practice, it wasn't always an intersectional movement. The fat underground dissolved after a few years. There were other feminist groups that had the same kind of intersectional politics, even though we weren't talking about it as intersectionality back then. And much like modern body positivity, had a lot of sort of centering of white folks and centering of, people who are not marginalized in other ways. Body positivity in its early days was sort of correcting that course. And then as it became co-opted by mainstream media and, used by capitalism, and you have people like Weight Watchers talking about body positivity, it loses some of that politic, or some of the people with that politic get, pushed to the side or shoved into the background when, really that sort of like the beginning of what we identify as the third wave of fat activist movement is that early social media body positivity movement. And that was a lot of Black and brown and LGBTQIA and disabled folks. And when you look at body positivity on social media now, that's not always what it is. In fact, that's often not what it is.
While the TikTok version of body positivity may not always call attention to the movement's more radical roots, folks like Tigress and Virgie work to constantly remind people that your relationship to your body is not happening in a vacuum. Whether you choose body positivity, body neutrality, or neither, all of us are living in a culture rampant with fat phobia that has real-life consequences.
Literally, there's research that shows that doctors take fat patients less seriously. Fat patients are less likely to receive preventive care, like cervical cancer exams, et cetera, right? Like these kinds of things. When you think about how this affects how fat phobia impacts the workplace, there's a wage gap between, I know this statistic for women, that it starts at about $9,000 to $19,000 a year that plus size women make less than their straight size counterparts. In addition to the fact that like higher weight people get sort of funneled into more physically laborious and lower paying jobs, and straight size people or thin people get sort of funneled into client facing, higher paying jobs. And it kind of goes on and on and on. And I mean, really, this is the backdrop that people are facing. And regardless of where you are on the weight spectrum, you're highly aware of these attitudes because they are not being hidden, right? They are literally being exposed in the media all the time.
One of the things that can be challenging for people about fat liberation movement in a personal way is that they begin to feel like they are somehow failing the movement if they have a day where they feel bad about their body. And body neutrality allows people to say, hey, I want to fight for my rights, but I might be doing that on a day when I don't feel that great about my body, or when I just don't feel that much about my body. And I don't have to be in a sort of rah-rah spirit about how much I love everything about myself. I think for fat people, and I think for other people in marginalized bodies too, like one challenge of body neutrality is there are definitely spaces where I don't want people to be neutral. I want people to be fat positive. I want people to be fat aware. So for example, I want my doctor to be neutral in terms of deciding what tests to give me or things like that. But I want him or her to be, or them to be fat aware when they're doing things like making sure they have equipment that fit my body, or making sure that there's space for me in the waiting room where I can sit down because the chairs don't all have arms or only hold people who weigh 150 pounds. Like, right, there are times when specific body awareness is really necessary, and body neutrality, when you get into the more political aspects of bodies and the access issues around bodies, has a danger to be a little too sort of like, we are all the same.
Totally.
We don't need to think about bodies because we're all the same.
We're not all the same. And the language we choose to talk about our bodies has consequences that go far beyond just us. We heard from Val LeClaire about this. She's a musician who is fat and disabled.
I used to lean into the overly positive motivation all the time, especially when combating the negative stereotypes and thoughts about being disabled and fat. And it's a good first step forward to change the rhetoric from your body is a good body if it meets these arbitrary aesthetic standards to your body is a good body because it completes these tasks for you, like walking, eating, laughing, hugging, etc. But that rhetoric excludes bodies that do not do these things. Disabled bodies are still beautiful and still fundamentally good, not because your body is kind to you, so you should be kind to your body, because not everyone's body is kind to them. But all bodies are still good bodies because they are what houses you.
If there is anything that takes me from intellectualizing these messages to really wanting to put them into lived practice, it's being an aunt. As I've watched my 3-year-old nephew grow up and start to repeat everything he hears, I'm reminded that he is watching me and absorbing everything. I know that it's a David and Goliath battle between me and diet culture, but how can I and all the other adults in their lives raise them to have more peaceful relationships with their bodies than the ones we have with our own? Step 1, rethink our definition of what constitutes a healthy body.
The root of this is healthy bodies. You do not know what a healthy body looks like because there is not one way to be healthy. You don't know what a healthy body eats. There's not one way to eat in a healthful way. And as a parent, to be mindful that you also don't want your kids to get the impression that health is something to moralize over somebody else.
Zoe Bisbing is a psychotherapist who specializes in child and adolescent eating disorders and body image. She and her colleague Leslie Block started the Full Bloom Project, which offers educational content to prevent child eating disorders.
It starts with really creating what we consider a body positive home, to really have a no body talk policy at home, to really be clear with your kids when they're at home that this is a safe place, that your body is growing as it is meant to grow. We eat in ways that make us feel good and that we listen to our internal cues, and that we want our home environment to have baby books and all sorts of books and as much media as possible available to our kids while they're in our homes, that they see as close to a utopia as possible, so that they understand that this can exist. Because then the other piece of it is when they go out into the world and face inevitably either, bullying directed at them, or they observe fat phobic comments being made, whether it's on a TV show or between kids on the playground. And we want those kids to be able to come to us either with their pain of what they're experiencing, and or with something they're observing that feels messed up to them. And we want to plant seeds so that they know something's wrong with that.
And I think one of the things about body neutrality that is so relevant to conversations about kids is how you talk to a kid about their appearance, or whether you do it at all. I've noticed I have two, a niece and nephew, and they're so adorable, and I want to comment on their appearance. And I could feel myself wanting to tell them like how cute they are, what they look like. But then I have this moment of thinking, what does the way that I am commenting on your body or how you look do to how you start to perceive yourself and how you start to perceive your worth? So how do you kind of think about the socialization that others do around kids' bodies and kids' appearances, and how to retrain yourself away from some of that?
It's hard. And I'm a realist when it comes to this, because I have little kids and I know that impulse to say, oh my gosh, you look so cute. Or when I see one of my son's friends and I haven't seen them in a year, to say, wow, you've grown so much. And for me, this is like, I'm so excited to see them grow. And so, okay, we do it. And this being said, we know from research that it's not just negative body comments that hurt. It's those positive body comments that can hurt too, because it increases our kind of self-objectification muscle. And we think about, oh, this person's pleased by me because of the way I look. So it's one thing to know that. And I think that sometimes it's the first step. Just know that like compliments even about appearance for children, it's not really the most loving thing you can do for a child. But if we can then take that next step to really try to make those comments, those enthusiastic comments about internal characteristics, traits that you think are special about that person, or if someone's put together a fantastically bizarre cowboy boots and pajamas and a raincoat, which I've seen my children's peers do. Wow, you're so creative. Like, how did you think to put those things together? So it does. It's like a new muscle for us because we are really inclined to make those positive comments about bodies. But, unfortunately, I hear in my own practice and with parents I work with so many stories of negative body comments, which are violent in so many ways. And so obviously we want to stop those as well. But even the positive ones require a little bit of rewiring on our part.
For parents who may be in a struggle with their own bodies, may have negative body image, may be working on their own relationships, but want to be a good model for their kids, what do you suggest that they think about or work on?
Well, I think that the word optics comes to mind because, everybody's in a different place in their journey. And I don't expect a parent that, comes to the Full Bloom Project, for example, to be fully ready to divest from diet culture and, immediately join the fat liberation movement. I mean, many of those folks aren't ready. They're not there. I wish they were, but they're not. But perhaps they're ready to, if they're, let's say, actively trying to, quote, fix or change their own bodies. If they're not ready to stop that themselves, hopefully they're ready to stop talking about it because we really do need to shut that down. And when I say create the optics, like I want parents to not neglect themselves. I want them to do this work too. There's a lot of reparenting work that we offer right within this movement. But I want parents to try to create at least the illusion that we don't do that here, just so that you can tomorrow, right, create a safer environment for your kids so that then those kids can create a safer environment for their, the community of the future.
Talk about some of those things to amp up. You suggested, kind of cutting down on how you talk about your own body, on critiquing your body, on commenting on other people's bodies. What are things to add to the conversation to encourage body acceptance or even body neutrality?
I think it's really important to talk actively about diversity, of size diversity in nature, in animals. I live in New York City. I love to look at all the dogs on the street. Like, oh my gosh, look at this size of this one and this one. And isn't it amazing that we're all shaped so differently? So on one hand, I want people to kind of immediately stop negative body talk. And yes, also the kind of body compliments. But to increase sort of observations about whether we're talking about humans, whether we're talking about dogs, trees, right? Opportunities in nature present themselves all the time just to plant seeds that diversity is it just is. And so really from early on, we want to make sure that we're vocal about that. And also, maybe not with your 1-year-old, but that you're vocal about injustice and how it's pretty messed up that, not all people get this yet, that all people should be treated equally. And also to talk about the importance of, sharing your pain. Like if you are feeling, upset to be in your body or upset about anything really, to be able to talk about it, right? Because one of the things we want to stop doing or help parents stop doing is when their own children start to feel a sense of emotional pain because they don't like something about their appearance, we want those parents to get better at supporting their child with the pain rather than help them change their bodies.
You've put together this beautiful resource called the ABCs of Body Positive Parenting. And there's one in particular I'd really love for you to talk about, which is A for ancestry. And I loved thinking about how better understanding personal ancestry could be a body positive parenting tool. I know I've talked with so many friends who from different cultural backgrounds who kind of had this moment of confusion almost when they went away to college and were suddenly distanced from their home of origin, which maybe had particular cultural traditions or particular kind of ways of being around food in your body. So I'd love for you to talk about ancestry as a body positive parenting tool.
Yeah, and I will give credit where it's due. Connie Sobczak, who's one of the mothers of the Body Positive, their actual entity, was the first guest that I had on the Full Bloom podcast and really talked to us a lot about ancestry. And we've sort of adapted it into a parenting practice. Honestly, creative ways to get our children to visually see their lineage, see what they're from, right? What stock they're from, literally. And to try to, both through visual representation, but also through conversation, try to help our children literally get that they are who they are for good reason. And that one of the things that I like to share as my own mother, who's learned a lot through my endeavor with Full Bloom, she's in her early 70s, and she said, I've always hated my feet. They're so big. And I've always, this is like one of her body image things. And she said, but I started to think about like how I've evolved, like my lineage, like my people evolved to give me these feet. And these feet have allowed me to work into my 70s in a relatively, manual labor-oriented job. And she had this new appreciation and reverence for her body, even many years later, in her later life. And I love that because it sort of allows her to connect with, she didn't get these big feet from nowhere. They came from her ancestors, and they actually serve a purpose, a function.
Body image work is not linear, which is why this is neither the first nor the last time we're going to talk about it on this show. So while I encourage you to do some reading, thinking, and step away from the mirror, I also want to leave you with some beautiful tips from Virgie Tovar on practices that she comes back to when she's having a bad body image day herself.
I think, honestly, some of them are a little more magical and some of them are kind of boring. I mean, I think about, CBT, right? Cognitive behavioral therapy or mindfulness. They're not bells and whistles, right? They're just things you do over and over and over again, right? Like that you have a body shaming thought. What is my response to that thought? I've sort of taught my brain, we don't react to those thoughts. And I think for me, the sort of the magical perhaps part of it is I've been more and more getting into the practice of understanding my body as an extension and a complete part of nature. And I think for me, just going out into nature, whether it's my park or or wherever, just even going outside and seeing a tree or something and remembering like, oh my God, I share a significant amount of DNA material with this tree, with this flower, with this bumblebee, as someone who's been taught to be so apart and alien and to hate my body. And I look at a tree and I'm like, I don't see any fault with that tree. I can't see any fault with myself either,
Embodied is a production of North Carolina Public Radio WUNC, a listener-supported station. If you want to lend your support to this podcast and WUNC's other shows on demand, consider a contribution at WUNC.org now. Incredible storytelling like you hear on Embodied is only possible because of listeners like you. Josie Torres produced this show with editorial help from Kaya Finlay and Amanda Magnus. Jenny Lawson is our sound engineer, and Quilla wrote our theme music. This is the last episode in our special New Year's series, Resolved, all about diet culture and how you can reset your relationship with food, movement, and your body in this new year. If you missed either of the first two installments, just scroll up in your podcast feed or go to our website, embodiedwunc.org. Also, make sure to check out the discussion guide that accompanies this series. We give you lots of questions to dig into and ways to apply these principles in your own life. You can check that out also at our website. If you enjoyed this series and want to support this podcast, there is an easy way that you can do that. Write us a review on iTunes or share this episode with a friend who you think would love it. I'm Anita Rao, taking on the taboo with you.